Okay. Welcome to everyone. This is my presentation will be concerned with the Libyan set of data and the field work done in the country. So as you can see from the title, the focus of the presentation is on the Libyan experience and the impact that daily hardship and trauma produces on the mental health of unaccompanied refugee minors who are detained in the country. As you can see here, the structure of the presentation is a quite simple one. I will first introduce the main aim of the study, so the specificities of the field research done in Libya, then present the results, discuss them, and provide finally some policy recommendations. The main scope of this study was to provide visibility to the impacts that the Libyan experience has on the mental health of unaccompanied refugee minors crossing the country. This is extremely important because of the centrality of Libya in Europe's externalized management of unwanted migration, and because of the centrality of the country in general for undocumented migration to Europe. And by studying these aspects in the country, we aim to innovate, to contribute to the study of unaccompanied minors' mental health in detention, but also to the specificities of the study of unaccompanied minors' mental health in the Libyan detention centers. As briefly commented by Malte before, this is a cross-sectional study which has been conducted by 3 researchers between April and June 2018 in 4 detention centers around Tripoli.
Okay, so importantly, the access to these centers was granted by the government of the National Accord, which governed that part of Libya. But also there was a support from the EU delegation in Libya. Why? Because these centers are also, all of them, funded directly and indirectly by the EU. Participants are 99 minors, 93 of which were male, and their average flight duration was about 22, almost 23 months, almost 2 years basically. And we controlled for the same measures as the ones that were presented before. But besides this bunch of data, here in this presentation precisely, I'm combining also some qualitative, some insight from the interviews which were conducted in the longitudinal studies which were conducted in Belgium, so the one conducted by Malta, but also the 2 ones that were conducted in Italy by Ocean and Sarah. So in terms of results, importantly, in terms of traumatic events, we can see that they were quite high in pre-migration, so before deciding to move. In peri-migration, so in the mobility to Libya, we have 1.77 average events, 1.59 later on, but we see that this number increases a lot since people arrive in Libya with 4.21 events on average. And of this traumatic event, the most frequent is witnessing physical abuse. You can see also the numbers on the tables just on the right side of the slides, which was followed by the experience of physical abuse. And the less frequent instead of this traumatic event, which was recorded, was sexual abuse, which was confirmed only by 9 of the minors we approached. Importantly, and here is where I'm going to mix a bit of also the data that comes from the other studies which were conducted in Italy and Belgium, we know that in fact minors while crossing Libya in and outside detention suffer multiple forms of violence, not only physical one. And also we have quite strong evidences of the fact that sexual violence is quite frequent, which contradict a little bit the data, but collected in Libya, but it's then quite consistent in the data collected elsewhere, so once in Europe. And here I just quote, so this sexual violence was especially frequent among the girls interviewed in Italian shelters. And I read once, is just one quote, so once they see you are black and if they hear that you are from Nigeria, it's even worse. They will beat you, rape you, shoot the boys, and nothing will happen. In any case, we had plenty of this testimony of sexual violence. Then verbal violence is also very frequent in the form of racism. Yeah, in Libya, I felt I was treated differently because I'm Nigerian. It's normal. They said we are black, we are Africans. There is what they say in Arab, that Nigerians are bad. So that is now how they treated us. They treated us different. Huh? And also there is very much a form of violence, which is called nonlinear violence, according to the categorization developed by Dempsey, which has to do with what elsewhere in the literature is also known as the policy of exhaustion. So is this idea of disruption of trajectory, of personal aspiration, this idea of prolonging to an indeterminate time the wait for things to happen. Huh? And this is very much present also in Libya, but also we will see later on also elsewhere, also once a minor arrive in Europe. But anyway, just to taken from one interviews, just to give you one idea of these permanent disruptions. So from the Libyan city of Sabrata, we kept changing cars from one small car to another. When we arrived in Sabrata, the smugglers put us in a small room. After they took us to the sea, the boat started sinking. They took us back to the same room and started beating. This kind of back and forth to different form of detention, different form of weights, imposed weights, kidnapping are very frequent again in the sample. Then also psychological violence, it's very much present, and one could say can also generate from the other forms of violence. And in particular, we have just two examples that we thought it was worth, I thought it was worth mentioning, which are imprisonment and forced labor. Of course, imprisonment is quite obvious since we were interviewing minors which were in detention at the time of the interviews. But importantly, in many accounts, we could see that detention happened also outside, imprisonment happened also outside formal detention facilities, and it was often combined with forced labor. And in particular, the accounts, because of the geography of where the research was conducted, many of the accounts of the kids and the young refugees we interviewed told about this passage in the city of Bani Walid, which works a little bit as an hub between the deserts and the sea. So it's a little bit a point of collection, if you want, where people arrive before trying to cross the Mediterranean. And there, apparently, it was very frequent for minors to be exploited for free labor or forced labor. In Bani Walid, I read from the quotes, we worked against our will. They forced us to. We worked in carrying rocks in house building, and they did not pay. And often this happens when young migrants are allowed to exit secluded place where they are forced to stay to hide. Okay. Then moving to the daily stressor in detention, we saw that they are, and this might sound quite obvious, but they were quite high. And the most prevalent of this basic need was not having enough clothing. But you can see in the tables just next also that there are also other basic needs that score relatively high. The same goes also for social need, and this relates, I think, to one of the findings that also Malte was presenting before. The most prevalent of the social need was the worry for the family back at home, and also hardship to communicate with them. So again, from the quantitative analysis, we could see that there is a relatively high levels of PTSD, anxiety, and depression. More social needs are associated with anxiety, and more pre-migration trauma significantly associated, so seems to be significantly associated with higher levels of PTSD, post-traumatic disorder. Sorry. Depression instead is significantly, but only marginally associated with the pre and peri-migration trauma. Okay, so those traumas that took place before leaving the country of origin or the country of residence, let's say, and during the journey to Libya. Importantly, and here is where I discuss the data in more details, importantly, we need to keep in mind that violence, the physical violence, but also the other forms of violence which are experienced by minors in Libya, can come from smuggler and traffickers. When I entered Libya, I read from the quotes, through the desert, thieves took our money against our will, and sometimes they kill others in front of us. I saw with my own eyes more than once one was talking in the car and they shoot him. Those people die in the desert. But it is very important also in the kind of expectation that minors might build traveling then to Europe, or the mistrust they might have to authorities later on throughout the migratory careers or trajectories, is that this violence is also, this extreme forms of violence also comes a lot from law enforcement official, let's say institutional actor, the Coast Guard, the police working in the centers. And I read again from a quote, when we were in prison, a policeman came with smugglers. We were 5, 3 of us were women, and 2 of them, maybe there is someone. When we were in prison, a policeman came with smugglers. We were 5, 3 of us were women, and 2 of them were pregnant. They beat and raped them. All of them died, and only me with another man survived, so that they asked us to pay $2,000. When we told them that we did not have the money, they started beating us again. And it is also very frequent, again, in the interviews collected in Libya, to see that there is some form of collaboration between law enforcement and smuggling, if you could say smuggling networks or trafficking networks. Importantly, we also saw that this violence tend to happen in these repeated forms, which we call the loops of violence. So basically, this violent event normally happens in a sort of sequence, which the more classical, archetypical one would be that you get first suffer violence to enter Libya, to cross the desert and so on. Then you probably suffer violence when you are caught by authorities trying to cross the Mediterranean, and then you will suffer again violence in detention and to free yourself, and you will re-enter the same loop, the same circle, because you will try again to cross the Mediterranean, and so on, so on. So this loop of violence as a repeated series of violent events which are perpetuated on minors by institutional and non-institutional actors who are indirectly involved, directly or indirectly involved in governing or facilitating migration. And another data which was, at least to me, a bit surprising, but not so surprising, is that the presence of international organizations in the centers, such as, for example, the UNHCR, but also the IOM, did not seem to provide any improvements on the living condition of URMs, or at least did not seem to provide safety. The monitoring, let's say, role wasn't so effective, at least in the centers we could access. And here a quote: "In the center we live with not enough food or water, and the guards beat us every day, and they only care about money. I feel like I am still living with smugglers, not with the UNHCR," which was, of course, operating in that specific centers. Rate of reported daily stress are alarming and dramatically high overall in the sample in Libya, and it seems to threaten severely URM's emotional, social, and cognitive developments. Rates of mental health difficulties are also high. A level of PTSD, depression, significantly associated with traumatic experience pre and peri-migration, and this was a little surprising. Trauma in Libya was not that much associated with mental health, and we tried to develop a possible explanation. And one, again, it's kind of similar to something that has been also mentioned by Malte before. So this idea that, especially in Libya, minors enter in this sort of survival mode because they are aware that there are these loops of violence that they've already experienced, that they will have to go across anyway in order to try to reach the other shores of the Mediterranean. So the detention itself, which was the environment where we interviewed the migrants, was already a traumatic experience. So in a way, they were immersed in a sort of prolonged traumatic experience, and were aware that there was more to come outside the centers. which means that they could hardly make sense of the trauma that they were experiencing. And at the same time, they knew they have to keep still and strong to move forward. Yeah. There is contradictory data on sexual abuse and violence, as I highlighted before, and that is something that I try to reflect basically a bit last minute. But to me, one possible explanation could be the gender distribution of the sample in Libya, which is mainly done by males. But also the specific environment in which interviews were carried out, which was in the detention center themselves. So if those violence were happening in detention while others were admitted, those ones were probably more problematic to be exposed. Finally, among the daily stressor, only social needs were associated with increased anxiety. The level of daily stressor was not associated also with depression, and this is nor with PTSD. And this, to us, could be due to the styling effect, so too high level of all the indicators to be able to detect any relevant or significant variation. In terms of recommendation, that's the very last. So they are mainly looking at the macro level, if you want, of policy, but I'll start from the first one. That's adequate preventive intervention to support unaccompanied minors must consider the impact of this very, very extremely tough experience that is crossing Libya. UMs in Libya are exposed to repeated experience of physical violence, but also other forms of violence, and show the high level of mental health problem. As for a single international law, it sounds quite obvious, the recommendation, but minors should never be detained, even less in a war-torn country such as Libya. Importantly, the presence and monitoring of international agencies such as UNHCR or IOM does not seem to lead to significant improvements, so that we either need to reform this kind of activities or rethink of their role in terms of, again, child protections. And importantly, but that's again pointing more at the policy-making world, probably, all these policies, which are very tough and produce all this psychological, if you want, cost on minors, do seem to have very little effectivity in stopping people from trying to migrate to Europe undocumented anyway. And that's it. Thank you very much for listening.